This is a history channel. I usually focus on historical events, not modern politics, and that's a choice. But today, I'm going to make an exception to that choice because the more content I make on the Second World War, the more I get people in the comments saying things like, Nazis were National Socialist. Let's not forget their far left political element. Or, in another flavour, socialists are leftists, including Nazis. And I think this is wrong. Not just politically wrong, but historically wrong. Now, of course, it doesn't help that terms like left and right are abstractions of quite complex political beliefs, but it is the best we have, and even so, Nazi Germany fits quite comfortably on the right side of this divide. So today I'm going to try and prove that to anyone who's on the fence. I will leave aside my personal feeling that it's a sad reflection of our times that this has become a matter of debate, but there you are. That said, let's begin. So the most common arguments I've seen are ones that go like this one. Commies always say Nazis was the right wing when the term is short for National Socialism. And this is actually true. National Socialism is where we get the term Nazi. And fun fact, when Hitler was doing his tour of Germany to rustle up popular support, he would actually subtly change the title depending on his audience. If, say, he was addressing a trade union in Berlin, he would capitalise the S in socialism, emphasising his solidarity with workers. But then the next day in Munich, when addressing conservatives, he'd make the S lowercase and capitalise the N in nationalism. He knew how to be a man for all sides. But in any case, the point does stand. It's literally in the name, National Socialist. Therefore, the Nazis were left-wing. Now, I don't want to spend too long on this argument because I think we can all see the problem with it. Things aren't always what they call themselves, which is why North Korea, despite being the most repressive nation on earth, still officially calls itself the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. It's false advertisement and, taken too literally, it'll get ya. Dry clothing works by getting your clothes wet, just with chemicals instead of water. French fries come from Belgium, not France. You get the idea. But by that same virtue, some things are exactly what they're called. The United States of America is a series of states united in America. So just saying the Nazis weren't socialist doesn't actually make that true. I'm going to have to prove it to you, and in order to do that, we need to look at politics in the early 20th century. So, before the outbreak of the First World War, there was one ideological game in town. Imperialist capitalism. Free markets, traditional values, expansion of territory, colonial ambitions, private property, all that stuff. Now, I'm not saying capitalism is always imperialist, but at this specific time, it usually was. But then, in 1917, just before the end of the First World War, a brand new ideology emerged from the shadows and took over an entire country. Russia went from the old world of imperial capitalism to a shiny new future under this novel political movement. Communism. Communists saw the defining features of capitalism as fundamental injustices and instead offered a new way. A classless society where property was collectively owned and distributed among the workers, where the church was stripped of its power and influence, and where the only war left to fight was between the workers who were oppressed and the capitalists who did the oppressing. This sudden bifurcation of political philosophy in 20th century Europe created a bit of a hoo-ha, both between, but especially within, nations. Nowhere was this more prevalent than in Germany, which had just been destroyed after the chaos of the First World War. Internationally humiliated and desperate at home, Germans started to squabble about which direction the country should take, the new left or the old right. This squabbling then led to a series of street fights between communists, desperate to bring Germany into the shiny new communist utopia, and the conservative factions, determined to keep communism at bay, restore Germany's national pride, and return to the politics of the old world. One of these right-wing anti-communist factions, which was particularly violent, was the Freikorps, and it's from this organisation that the Nazis would go on to fill their ranks, including major figures such as Ernst Röhm, Rudolf Hess, Reinhard Heydrich, Karl Ernst, and Martin Bormann. The ranks of the Nazi Party were firmly and comfortably drawn from the right of the political spectrum, not the left. But that's not the point I actually want to make. Not yet, at least. What I'm really trying to say is that by the 1920s there were two ideological games in town. Old world capitalism and new world communism. And as I said, this two-sided struggle created a lot of hoo-ha across Europe as countries agonised over which side to pick. The devil you know, or the devil you don't. And all that was until 1922, when a man named Benito Mussolini marched on Rome with a brand new offer. A third option. Not communism, but not exactly capitalism either. Under Il Duce, you'd get the best of both worlds. A strong state that preserved national pride, but whilst also having a hand in the economic market that would make sure that the workers would be well fed, and without all that hassle of abolishing private property. Everybody wins. Mussolini called it fascism, named after fasces from ancient Rome, which were used to symbolise political power. And for a while, the world was pretty smitten. International coverage was positive, and Il Duce's third way seemed to be going quite well for Italy, at least in the beginning. Hitler saw all this going down and started to model himself on Mussolini's speeches and rhetoric, adopting this third way. In fact, when the two men actually met for the first time, Mussolini would even joke that Hitler made for a pretty uninspiring tribute act. In the end, of course, it would be Hitler making fun of Il Duce, but history loves irony. In any case, with fascism, a new political movement was born in Europe, and over the decades it would pop up in Spain, Germany, Croatia, Hungary, and Romania. Some say it hasn't completely left us yet. Unfortunately, though, as we've mentioned, things don't always perform as advertised, and before long, this third way between the new and the old, the left and the right, just became a more extreme version of the old and the right. And this happened both in Italy, but most importantly, since we're judging the Nazis, it happened in Germany too. Instead of boldly planting a confident step into a brave new world, Hitler's first move was to go old school and allied himself with the church. On July 20th, 1933, Hitler signed the Reich's Concordant with the Roman Catholic Church. The deal was that if the church backed Hitler in the Reich, then they'd have special privileges in German society, most crucially in education. National Socialism was suddenly starting to look a bit more Christian nationalist. Meanwhile, on the left side of Europe, communist Russia was openly hostile to the church. Religious education was banned, churches were destroyed, and monks were imprisoned. The institution of religion was completely uprooted from society. The right allied with the church, the left destroyed it. But that's not the full picture, of course, so let's get to the nitty-gritty that we all think things are defined by: economic policy. After all, the fascists were supposed to intervene in the economy in order to protect workers' rights. In reality, not so. Hitler did get his mittens in the market, but unlike the left, where capitalists were thrown out and industry was collectivized, under the Nazis, the capitalists and industrialists were allowed to stick around so long as they helped build the war machine. This is why Nazi Germany had a nasty collection of war profiteers who made themselves extremely rich from feeding the insatiable beast. I.G. Farben, which made Zyklon B, and Krupp being prime examples. But whilst capitalists were able to accrue obscene wealth under the Nazi regime, trade unions, a staple of the left-leaning workers' movement, were abolished. Literally. Under Hitler, all trade unions were banned, leaders were whisked off to concentration camps, and a new organisation called the German Labour Front was established instead. But that was actually a puppet of the Nazi regime. The whole time, profits flowed handsomely, and the working class remained underpaid. Not very left-wing. Now, that's not to say that the working class got a taste of utopia in the Soviet Union either. That experiment turned out to be a horrific failure for the working class as well, just for very different reasons. Moving away from economics, though, you can also look at the behaviour of Nazi Germany on the international stage to get a flavour of their politics. Every time the Nazi Party took a stance on global affairs, they protected the right and aggressively hindered the left. You need only look at the Spanish Civil War, where Franco was able to steamroll the Spanish communists, but only with the help of German weapons, most famously at the Guernica, bombed by German planes. And if you're still in doubt, just ask the Führer himself. In Mein Kampf, he couldn't be clearer. The revolution of the proletariat, led by the Jews, is a mortal danger to the German nation and must be crushed with uncompromising force. So, yes, very anti-communist, even from the horse's mouth. But that quote actually brings us to the last point I want to talk about, which is that although both the communist regimes and fascist regimes had an awful track record of human rights, for the communists, the enemy was the capitalist, the bourgeoisie, the rich oppressor. But for the Nazis, the enemy wasn't economic, it was racial. Non-Aryans and Jews were the enemy. Similarly, communism saw itself as an international movement. Workers first. Nazism, by contrast, was a nationalist movement. Germany first. Communism, at least on paper, aimed for a flat hierarchical structure based on equality between all. Fascism was quite happy with hierarchies. It made sense to them, and they were happy to preserve them. Big differences between both sides. I could go on, but I think you get the point. And I think the more interesting question for the moment is, why are people suddenly saying this, even though it's pretty obviously untrue? And I don't think it's just a case of historical disagreement here. In fact, I think the motivation to say that the Nazis were left-wing is political. Right now, there's a pretty fierce divide between right and left in our culture. And as a result, rightly or wrongly, the word fascist, or Nazi, is being thrown around a fair bit. And I think that this is an attempt by the right to distance themselves from the atrocities of the Nazi regime. You know, the right don't do this thing, don't forget they were the socialists, this is what being left-wing gets you, we're the good guys, etc., etc. And not only is this wrong and intellectually dishonest, it's also ineffective. Even if I was to agree with you that the Nazis were left-wing after all, it's being too far left that makes you a Nazi, they're the bad guys, even if I concluded that, you'd still have all of your work cut out for you to make the right clean. I mean, even if the Nazis were lefties, how do you explain the Japanese Empire with their atrocities in China, their racial dogma, their literal god king on the throne, and militaristic corporatism? Would you say that they were left-wing too? How would you account for Ante Pavelić in Croatia, who took power under the guise of Catholic nationalism and went on to commit crimes against humanity so depraved that it shocked even the SS? Was this also left-wing? Of course not. The Croatian Ustasha, Imperial Japan, and Nazi Germany were right-wing. And no matter how much you might hate that fact, it's still true. And that doesn't mean you should be left-wing, by the way. I'm not trying to make the case for the left or against the right. Extremes on any side can be dangerous. What I'm really trying to say is that you're not helping the right or owning the libs when you lie about history. Instead, you're hurting all of us by obscuring our knowledge of the past and making us more likely to repeat our worst mistakes. Mistakes which could, at the end of the day, affect you. Without honesty and a genuine respect for the truth, we'll never learn to share this planet with each other without more tragedy and bloodshed. In the meantime, guys, take care of each other and have a great summer. Bye-bye.